In May of 2009, 48-year-old Rodrigo Rosenberg was at the peak of his career as one of Guatemala's most prominent lawyers. Tall, handsome, and charismatic, Rodrigo had law degrees from both Cambridge University and Harvard University, and he was the co-founder of a very successful corporate law office in Guatemala City, the country's capital. Rodrigo chose a career in law because he liked the clarity of the law, if it was practiced fairly. He felt like it was the best way of settling disagreements and disputes. But the thing that really made Rodrigo stand out in the Central American country of 16 million people was not just his brilliance and drive. It was the fact that he had a reputation for absolute honesty, because Guatemala was a country best known in the world for its incredible levels of corruption and violence. Even though 36 years of civil war between authoritarian rulers and leftist guerrillas had ended back in 1994, that conflict had left more than 200,000 people, many of them civilians, dead, and another 45,000 people, quote, disappeared, which meant either killed or kidnapped. Mostly the work of government forces or right-wing paramilitary groups. But after the 1994 peace agreement was signed, most of the people in Guatemala who had committed the murders and other widespread human rights violations that took place during the Civil War were never prosecuted or called to account for their crimes. Instead, in the post-Civil War Guatemala, these should-be war criminals simply turned to new careers, such as participating in organized crime, becoming assassins for hire, or getting in on the very lucrative Central and South American drug trade. And 15 years later, even though Guatemala had a democratically elected civilian president who had promised to root out crime and government corruption, these criminals and their criminal networks had still been able to reach their tentacles in almost every government and law enforcement agency. By 2009, Guatemala had the third highest murder rate of any country in the world, averaging more than 123 homicides every week, and 97% of those murders went unsolved. And the few cases that did go to trial often ended with the alleged killers going free after judges or prosecutors or witnesses were bribed, threatened, or even murdered. So in this sea of corruption, where everyone with power seemed to have dirt on their hands, Rodrigo stood out for his willingness to shamelessly call out criminal behavior wherever he saw it. So to anyone who knew Rodrigo, it didn't come as any surprise when he wasn't just horrified when one of his very own clients was assassinated in broad daylight. He was absolutely furious, especially since this particular client, Musa Khalil, had a reputation for being a very ethical businessman who treated his workers fairly. Since arriving in Guatemala from Lebanon when he was just a young man, 76-year-old Musa had worked his way up from poverty to become a successful coffee producer and textile manufacturer. Although Rodrigo was not personally close to Musa, Rodrigo admired and respected the older man because the man refused to steal from the state or make payoffs to get favorable deals on his coffee or manufacturing companies. Musa's assassination took place in Guatemala City on April 14, 2009, as Musa and his 37-year-old daughter, Marjorie, were waiting in their car at a traffic light while on their way to lunch. A car pulled up quickly behind them, and a man hopped out and approached the front passenger seat of the Khalil's car where Musa was sitting, pulled out a 9mm pistol, and he fired 9 shots into Musa's head and torso. By the time the police arrived, the gunman had fled the scene on the back of a motorcycle driven by an accomplice. Musa, along with his daughter, were both dead. It would turn out that one of those 9 bullets that were fired at Musa had passed right through his body and struck and killed his daughter. She was not the intended target. She was just collateral damage. Musa and his whole family were people with power and influence. They had personal ties with people inside the administration of Guatemala's president, Álvaro Colom. If Musa could be gunned down in cold blood in the middle of the day, others among the Guatemalan elite worried that the same thing could happen to them too. Even though thousands of people turned out for the funeral service of Musa and his daughter, including President Colom's powerful private secretary, police made absolutely no progress on tracking down the killers, and it wasn't long before the murders just seemed like all the others in Guatemala. Just numbers on a stat sheet. Except this time, Rodrigo had had enough. Musa had been a good man, and his innocent daughter, Marjorie, had left behind a husband and 2 children. And so if the police were not going to catch the killers, then Rodrigo would. Almost as soon as Rodrigo got started investigating the murders, he noticed that even by Guatemalan standards, the police seemed to have gathered virtually no information outside of taking the obligatory statements from witnesses who saw the assassination and asking Musa's family if he had any business or money troubles. As Rodrigo began calling some of his contacts within the government about the police investigation, he began to wonder whether there was an active attempt going on inside President Colom's circle of advisors to cover up some connection that the government itself might have to the assassination. Just a few days after Musa's funeral, Rodrigo turned to another one of his clients, a man named Luis Mendizabal. Luis operated a store for handmade suits, but this was just a front. Luis's real profession was around the collection of secrets and information. Luis did not look the part of a spy, but as he measured and cut fabric and chatted with a wealthy clientele that included criminals, businessmen, military police, and government bureaucrats, Luis gathered huge amounts of insider intel on what was going on in their country. Before long, Luis had come up with a possible lead in the Musa murder case. A few months before the assassination, at the very beginning of 2009, Musa had been nominated to serve on the board of directors for 2 institutions that both had ties to something called the Rural Development Bank, or the Ban Rural. The 2 institutions that had invited Musa to join them were engaged in a power struggle over which one of them would control the bank. Luis suspected that Musa, as he began to do his own research on these 2 institutions, had uncovered that one or both of them were engaged in financial mismanagement and threatened to expose them. Rodrigo couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was everything he was fighting against, and so it wasn't long until this case consumed Rodrigo's life. Rodrigo stopped going into his law office. He wasn't getting enough sleep. His diet changed. He stopped taking the time to do the activities he loved, such as cycling. This investigation had become more than just finding the killers. It was about trying to actually stop corruption at the heart of Guatemala's politics. And in early May of that year, Rodrigo suddenly knew, without a doubt, that all of that digging and all of the documents he was putting together about corruption at Ban Rural, all the names and dates of meetings, the involvement of President Colom and his wife, all of it was finally getting him closer to the people who had murdered his client. But things were also getting more serious for Rodrigo. For weeks, he'd had that feeling that he was being followed, that everywhere he went outside of his apartment, someone was watching him. Not just that, he also started receiving threatening phone calls. The first call came on May 5th. It only lasted long enough for the caller to tell Rodrigo to stop his investigation into the murders. After that, the calls came once a day with the same message. And even though Rodrigo couldn't recognize the deliberately distorted voice on the other end of the line, he started to suspect that the threats were coming directly from within President Colom's inner circle, from Colom's private secretary himself, a man named Gustavo Alejos, who actually had an office directly across from the apartment where Rodrigo lived. Not only was Gustavo an influential advisor to the president, his brother was the head of the Guatemalan Congress. After these threatening calls started coming in, Rodrigo was far more excited at this development than afraid. On May 8th, Rodrigo visited Luis at his shop. As soon as Rodrigo walked in, Luis pulled him to the side and he told Rodrigo to stop his investigation into the murders and instead he should flee Guatemala altogether. Luis understood how serious this investigation was getting. He also knew about the threatening phone calls, but Rodrigo said he could not stop now, and in fact, he was there to ask Luis for a favor. It was an insurance policy that no matter what happened in any court of law, the information that Rodrigo had uncovered was guaranteed to become public knowledge. Reluctantly, Luis agreed, and after discussing the details, they arranged to meet again the next day. As Rodrigo left the store, Luis had a bad feeling. He was certain that whatever the outcome of Rodrigo's plans, it was sure to bring a lot of pain to his family and friends. Luis had been as good as his word and had helped Rodrigo put together the final pieces of the case that he had been building, one fact at a time, against the Guatemalan government. Rodrigo's bodyguards, who also acted as his driver, had willingly offered assistance with a few tasks. The previous week, Rodrigo couldn't tend to his own needs, including taking his bike for maintenance. It had been over a month since he had engaged in serious cycling, but the previous night, he had resolved to go for a ride in the morning, even if it was a short one. Fortunately, the weather favored Rodrigo. Although May was a typically rainy month in Guatemala, that particular morning was dry, with the sun piercing through the clouds. Rodrigo put on his navy blue cycling shorts and a matching blue short-sleeved top and tied his white sneakers. Leaving his room, he glanced at the gold watch on his left wrist before proceeding towards the front door. He took a moment to grab his red and white mountain bike, which leaned against the wall in the front hallway. He rolled the bike to the elevator, and within a minute, he was guiding it out of the apartment complex onto the sidewalk. The sidewalk led to the main street that extended horizontally in front of the building. Once Rodrigo reached the end of the main road, he scanned both directions, checking for any approaching cars. Just as he did, the sun emerged, casting a vibrant light on the grass and trees lining the street. Prior to mounting his bike, Rodrigo ensured that his iPod was set to play his favorite band, Santana. He pressed the play button and then pushed his bike off the curb, entering the road. Turning right, he swiftly hopped onto the bike and started pedaling down the street after only a few hundred yards. Rodrigo made another right turn, diverting from the main road onto a service road. The sun's rays bounced off the windows of a tall apartment building, adorned in brown and white, situated just ahead on the left. After a few minutes, Rodrigo observed a man dashing across the street from left to right. Initially, he assumed it was a jogger. However, Rodrigo soon noticed that the man was attired in jeans and a dark jacket and a raised collar. As the man completed his crossing and arrived on the right side, he slowed down and fixated his gaze on Rodrigo. Their eyes briefly met, and then the man in jeans and a jacket abruptly sprinted towards Rodrigo. Before Rodrigo could react, he instinctively veered sharply to the right, causing his bike to approach the end of the curb. The man swiftly closed the distance between them, retrieving a gun from the waistband of his jeans. Rodrigo sensed the impact of the initial 3 bullets and heard a resounding crack accompanying each shot. As his bike crashed onto the pavement, Rodrigo toppled backward, partially landing on the grassy median. By the time the assailant fired 2 more rounds, shattering Rodrigo's jaw and forehead, Rodrigo's life had already come to an end. Within seconds, nearby residents heard the revving of an engine as a car sped away into the distance. Within minutes, residents of the neighborhood dialed 911, urgently reporting the sounds of gunfire. Rodrigo's bodyguard noticed the wailing sirens and the police cars obstructing the service road near his employer's apartment. He decelerated his pace, observing as the police established a perimeter. Amidst the unfolding scene, he thought he caught a glimpse of a red and white bike lying on the pavement, a bike he knew belonged to Rodrigo. Regret filled his thoughts as he wished he had insisted on staying overnight and accompanying Rodrigo on his bike ride. After a few minutes, Eduardo, Rodrigo's son, arrived at the crime scene, accompanied by Luis, the close friend of Eduardo's father. Both Eduardo and Luis were stricken, their faces pale, as they identified themselves to the Guatemalan police officers who approached them. The officers were eager to gather information about the incident. They assured Eduardo and Luis that they would do everything possible to apprehend the killer. However, before the police could delve into their investigation, an event occurred that would push the Guatemalan government to the brink of collapse. On May 12th, just 2 days after Rodrigo's murder, hundreds of people gathered in a church to attend his funeral service. The pews were filled to capacity with family members, friends, clients, government officials, influential business leaders, and the affluent members of the capital's social elite. Following Eduardo's delivery of his father's eulogy, Rodrigo's friend, Luis, stepped forward to address the mourners. With a deep breath, Luis acknowledged that everyone present shared the same burning question. Why would anyone want to kill Rodrigo Rosenberg? He then raised his hand, revealing a case containing a DVD. Luis declared that the DVD held the answer to that question, explaining that Rodrigo had left instructions for him to make the 18-minute video public in the event of his murder. Luis, having watched the video only after Rodrigo's death, invited anyone in the crowd who was interested to take a copy of the DVD upon leaving, once the surprised and excited murmurs subsided. One of the individuals attending the funeral, a government minister, accepted Luis's invitation and took a copy of the DVD. Immediately, the minister contacted President Colom's personal secretary, Gustavo Alejos, to inform him about the shocking revelation. A few minutes later, the minister discreetly left the church and drove directly to the National Palace in Guatemala City, the residence of President Colom and his wife. Inside the palace, President Colom, accompanied by his vice president and closest advisors, convened in his office. An aide inserted the disc into the president's computer and pressed play. Within seconds, they were all captivated by the sight of Rodrigo, seated alone behind a table against a blue backdrop. Rodrigo donned his customary navy blue suit, neatly pressed white shirt, light blue tie, and wedding ring. The video's production lacked professionalism and refinement, yet that somehow amplified the impact of Rodrigo's message, sending shivers down the spines of the president and his aides. Without wasting a moment, Rodrigo dropped the bombshell that would reverberate worldwide as the 18-minute video was uploaded to YouTube, soon going viral under the straightforward title, YouTube Murder. In the video, Rodrigo spoke calmly and directly, stating, "If you are watching or hearing this message, it means that I have been murdered by President Álvaro Colom with the assistance of his personal secretary, Gustavo Alejos." Rodrigo attributed the assassination of Musa Khalil and his daughters to the president, his wife, and Gustavo Alejos. According to Rodrigo, Musa's connection to the Rural Development Bank, Banrural, had exposed the president and first lady's misuse and embezzlement of the Banrural funds. Rodrigo claimed that the president's motive for killing him was rooted in Rodrigo's first-hand knowledge of the plot to murder Musa, as well as his possession of evidence implicating the president and first lady in the embezzlement and laundering of millions of dollars through Banrural. In his video, Rodrigo cautioned Guatemalans against falling for the smear campaign and cover-ups that would inevitably follow these accusations. He concluded with an impassioned plea for massive government reform, asserting that it was a time to remove President Colom from power and replace him with the vice president, who was perceived as honest and untainted, tasked with restoring the rule of law in Guatemala. The impact of Rodrigo's video was profound and far-reaching. Within hours of its release on YouTube, Guatemala was thrown into an unforeseen political crisis. The majority of Guatemalans believed Rodrigo's claims, and even some of the president's own advisors questioned their veracity. Instead of directly addressing the accusations, the president's initial response was to dispatch 2 aides to publicly dismiss the video as a forgery. However, this approach backfired, only intensifying the public's interest. Under mounting pressure, President Colom eventually appeared on national television that night to refute the allegations. However, his demeanor exuded fear and nervousness, failing to convince many. Meanwhile, the video gained tremendous international viewership, causing YouTube servers to crash. Protesters wearing white shirts as a symbol for their demand of a corruption-free government began flooding the streets of Guatemala City, further amplifying the calls for change. By the end of Tuesday, May 12th, Álvaro Colom, the president, was acutely aware that his presidency teetered on the edge of collapse. In response to the demands of protesters and the influential Guatemalan elite, who insisted that an internationally backed agency oversee the investigation into Rodrigo's death, President Colom had no choice but to comply. Consequently, by the following morning, May 13th, the entire investigation fell under the jurisdiction of a United Nations-sanctioned commission known as the CICIG. The commission dedicated months to unraveling the details surrounding Rodrigo's murder and the underlying motives. They left no stone unturned in their pursuit of the truth. The gang responsible for carrying out the shooting was identified without much difficulty, thanks to CCTV footage capturing the crime. However, the investigators struggled to determine the motive behind the gang's actions, realizing that orders had originated from higher authorities. It was clear that Rodrigo's assassination had been a paid hit, but the source of the order remained elusive. Additionally, the investigators strongly suspected the presence of an insider. Rodrigo, an avid cyclist who had temporarily stopped riding due to his involvement in the case, raised questions as to how the gang members knew about his bike ride that day and the specific route he would take. It became evident that someone had leaked the information, but the identity of this inside man remained unknown. The breakthrough came when the investigators discovered a weathered piece of paper bearing a faint signature, which eventually led to the revelation of the so-called inside man's identity. Based on the accumulated evidence, the following is a reconstruction of the events surrounding Rodrigo Rosenberg's murder. On Friday, May 1st, which was 16 days after the killing of Musa and his daughter Marjorie, as well as 9 days prior to Rodrigo's own murder, the inside man responsible for orchestrating the assassination contacted one of his most trusted associates. He instructed the associate to purchase 2 prepaid mobile phones, emphasizing the need for cash payment and advising against signing any paperwork or sales receipts. Following these instructions, the associate procured the phones and delivered them, along with the sales receipt, to the inside man's office. By this point, the inside man had already made arrangements for Rodrigo's assassination. He had approached 2 individuals who were not only close friends, but also relatives of Rodrigo, a pair of influential brothers who owned a major pharmaceutical company in Guatemala. The inside man presented his request, describing the target as an extortionist, and the brothers suggested a criminal gang capable of carrying out the hit for approximately $40,000. The 3 men finalized the details, with the brother assuring the inside man that they would handle contacting the hitman, arranging the payment, and providing a burner phone for communication. The inside man determined the murder date to be Sunday, May 10th, and pledged to provide the hitman with a detailed physical description of the target, as well as specific instructions regarding the time and location of the assassination. Commencing on Monday, May 4th, the inside man began using the second prepaid cell phone to make daily calls to Rodrigo's personal cell phone. During these calls, he uttered a single threat, urging the lawyer to halt his investigation into Musa Khalil's assassination. On May 9th, just one day prior to Rodrigo's murder, the inside man contacted the hitman to inform them that Rodrigo would be vulnerable while cycling. On the following day, shortly before 8 a.m., as Rodrigo left his apartment and turned onto a nearby service road, the two hitmen, positioned outside in a black Mazda with tinted windows, received a message on their phone. The driver answered the call and activated the speakerphone, allowing both hitmen to hear the voice of the inside man. The shooter, ensuring his 9mm pistol was loaded, listened attentively. The inside man's voice was calm and subdued as he described their target: a tall, slender man wearing navy shorts, a light blue top, and white sneakers. He informed them that Rodrigo would exit the apartment building at approximately 8:05 a.m., riding a red and white mountain bike. The hitmen were instructed to trail Rodrigo onto the service road and carry out the ambush from behind. They were told to shoot him in the back, followed by at least 4 additional shots to his neck, jaw, and forehead. Furthermore, the inside man emphasized the importance of destroying the cell phone and SIM card he had provided to the hitmen. Rodrigo made his way to the apartment elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. Upon reaching the ground floor, he exited the building and turned right, proceeding along the main street. After covering a few hundred yards, he veered onto the service road. As he spotted a man wearing jeans and a dark jacket running toward him, Rodrigo momentarily tensed up, but swiftly reacted. He promptly steered his bike towards the side of the road, applying the brakes forcefully to come to an abrupt halt. Disembarking from his bike, he let it drop onto the pavement in front of him. Seating himself on the curb, his back facing the approaching man, Rodrigo had only a moment before feeling the initial impact of a bullet striking his back, before he could register the blow or experience any pain. Successive shots followed, one piercing his cheek, another his neck, and one just below his jaw. Finally, with the assailant standing directly in front of him, the final bullet was fired into his forehead, causing his upper body to recoil and fall backward onto the grassy median. The shocking truth would eventually emerge. Rodrigo, the person responsible for orchestrating his own assassination. Devastated by the murders of his client, Musa, and Musa's daughter, Marjorie, Rodrigo had confided in his son Eduardo and his friend Luis about a secret he held. Unbeknownst to others, Rodrigo had been deeply in love with Marjorie, and their plan was to marry once she divorced her husband. The wedding ring Rodrigo wore at the time of his death, captured in the YouTube murder video, had been a cherished gift from Marjorie shortly before her tragic demise. Overwhelmed by the profound grief caused by the senseless killing of the woman he loved, combined with his unwavering belief that a corrupt president, his wife, and personal secretary were behind Musa's assassination, Rodrigo found himself consumed by utter hopelessness. During his investigation into Musa's murder, Rodrigo came to realize that even if he could substantiate his corrupt allegations against the government, the individuals in power would likely evade prosecution or punishment. In early May, Rodrigo, burdened by despair, devised a plan that would not only end his own personal anguish, but also pave the way for genuine reform in Guatemala. His plan involved staging a suicide that would be disguised as an assassination. Through the video he intended to create before his death, Rodrigo hoped to spark a bloodless coup that would topple President Álvaro Colom's administration. It was Rodrigo who contacted his wife's cousins, who owned a prominent pharmaceutical company, seeking their assistance in arranging a hit on an alleged extortionist, someone who, unbeknownst to them, was Rodrigo himself. The trusted lieutenant assigned to acquire the prepaid cell phones for this operation was none other than Rodrigo's loyal bodyguard and driver. Rodrigo ensured that one of the prepaid phones would reach the hired hitman, while he used the other phone to make threatening calls to his own personal cell phone. Through these calls, Rodrigo provided his killers with his own physical description and detailed instructions on when and where they could find and eliminate him. The discovery of Rodrigo's identity as the inside man might have remained concealed if not for the crucial security footage that led investigators to the owner of the black Mazda. Additionally, Rodrigo's bodyguard made a critical error that linked the prepaid cell phones to his employer. Despite Rodrigo's cautionary instructions, the bodyguard violated his directive and signed his name on one of the sales tax slips when purchasing the burner phones. He then submitted this slip bearing his faded signature to a secretary at Rodrigo's law office. While Rodrigo's allegations of government corruption, which were captured on video, proved to be true and resulted in the removal of numerous corrupt officials by the CICIG, it was discovered that Musa Khalil's assassination and the unintended killing of his daughter, Marjorie, were not orchestrated by Guatemalan government officials. As it turned out, Musa, known for his honesty and integrity, had been involved in purchasing contraband from criminal networks for his textile factory. When Musa refused to pay the suppliers, they orchestrated his murder. Once Judge Castrosona unveiled his findings, revealing Rodrigo as the mastermind behind his own assassination, the CICIG government filed charges against Rodrigo's cousins and the 10 members of the criminal gang who aided in the hit. Interestingly, the YouTube murder video scandal ended up bolstering President Colom's presidency. His decision to hand over the investigation of Rodrigo's death to the CICIG, patiently awaiting their report, projected an image of a composed and confident leader. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure you hit that subscribe button. We post new stories every week covering the darker side of our universe. If you want to see more videos like this, I highly recommend that you click the video now on screen. That video has been selected specifically for you.